Good evening, friends. It is Wednesday, November 13th, 2019. As we've talked about all day and all week, Miss Tori just loves to talk about it. It is World Kindness Day today, and that was inspired by Mr. Rogers himself, my hero. So always choose kindness. Very important message, my friends. All right, we are going to continue reading. Heroism begins with her. We are on Here to Stay, Women in the Korean War. The Korean War was 1950 to 1953. It was fought between North Korea with support from the Soviet Union and China, and South Korea with support from the U.S. The U.S. supplied most of the soldiers, but other countries contributed troops. Korea had been ruled by Japan from 1910 until the end of World War II. In 1948, Korea split into two regions along the 38th parallel with separate governments, but neither side accepted the status of the other. The fighting began in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. The fighting stopped in 1953, but no peace treaty was ever signed. During World War II, women proved their importance to the nation's military. More than 350,000 women served their country honorably, and their contributions as nurses, pilots, engineers, and in almost every other non-combat job helped to ensure the victory of the Allied forces. After the war, all the branches of the armed forces had to reevaluate the role of women in the military. Initially, women were expected to serve for the duration of the war plus 6 months. But the use of women in the military had proved so successful that there was a movement to make women a permanent part of the armed forces. And in 1948, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which gave women permanent status and granted them veterans' benefits. In the post-war period, Congress also established the Air Force as a separate branch of the armed forces. Some women who had served with the Air Force and the Women's Army Corps decided to transfer to Women in the Air Force, the women's unit of the new Air Force. The women in the Air Force remained active until 1976, when women were finally accepted into the Air Force on an equal basis with men. At first, women in the Air Force was limited to 4,000 enlisted women and 300 female officers. Although they worked for the Air Force, women were not trained or permitted to serve as pilots. Most served in clerical or medical positions. Social trends after World War II reestablished the feminine ideals of woman as wife, mother, and homemaker. Many women readily embraced these traditional roles, but some didn't want to give up the independence and self-worth they had discovered in military service and work outside the home. Women who wanted to serve in the military had to choose between service and family. A woman would be discharged if she became pregnant, and mothers with children under age 18 were not allowed to enlist. Despite these restrictions, many women did continue with their military service. Not long after the new organization of the military, the United States was drawn back into war. In 1950, President Harry Truman ordered the armed forces into combat in Korea. During the Korean War, more than 50,000 women served at home and abroad. One of the most important changes in military organization was the creation of MASH units, Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals. You ever heard of the show MASH? Before your time. It's okay if you haven't. It's before my time, actually, but I grew up watching the oldies, so I love MASH. Anyhow, in combat zones, more than 700 women served as nurses in MASH units, which were credited with lowering death rates from battle injuries by 50% compared to World War II levels. In addition, helicopters were introduced, allowing for speedier evacuation of the wounded and making it easier to move troops and supplies. Army women who had joined the reserves following World War II were voluntarily recalled to active duty during the Korean War. Although no women's Army Corps units were sent to Korea, about a dozen black women of the Air Force served in Korea in administrative roles. During the Korean War, medical air evacuation nurses and medical specialists were the only women in the Air Force allowed to serve in the battle zone. Other women served in support roles as air traffic controllers, weather observers, parachute riggers, and radar operators. And we have several stories of women from the Korean War, and I'm only going to read one, but some honorable mentions to look into is Staff Sergeant Barbara Barnwell, Courage at Sea. She saved a fellow Marine. Ezra Black, first in line. Eleanor C. LaCure, Redefining the Role of Women. And Geraldine Pratt May, Organizing the Air Force. And we are going to read about Johnita Ruth Boneham, the nurse who forgot fear. Johnita Ruth Boneham served as a flight nurse with the 801st Medical Air Evacuation Squadron in Takikawa, Japan during the Korean War. Before serving in the Korean War, Bonham had volunteered as a second lieutenant in the Medical Corps of the Army Air Corps during World War II. After the war, she resigned from active duty but rejoined the military to serve in the Korean War as a first lieutenant in the Air Force. On the night of September 26, 1950, she was flying on a C-54 cargo plane that had been converted to a mobile energy hospital. About a half-mile from shore, the plane stalled and crashed into the Sea of Japan. The aircraft broke into 3 pieces and began to sink. Bonham fought her way out of the submerged plane and began swimming through the choppy seas. She clung to a floating bag until she could reach a rope tied to a life raft. Rather than climbing to safety, Bonham stayed in the water and pulled other survivors toward the boat. I lost my train of thought. She didn't seem to take account of her own injuries. She rescued 17 of her patients before finally being pulled out onto one of 2 life rafts. The survivors were found by a Japanese fishing boat and taken to shore. Bonham spent 9 months in the hospital recovering from her injuries, which included a fractured skull and broken bones in her face, shoulder, and wrist. In recognition of her selfless and heroic efforts to save her patients on October 18, 1950, in Tokyo, General George Stratemeyer gave Bonham the Distinguished Flying Cross, making her the first female recipient of this honor. The Cavalcade of America radio show aired a program about her titled The Nurse Who Forgot Fear. On April 9, 1952, articles about her bravery appeared in Reader's Digest and various women's magazines. She was promoted to captain and remained in the military for 2 years after the accident. She married Colonel Clifton Willard Bovey, and they had 3 children. She retired from the military for medical reasons in 1952. Bonham died of cancer in Colorado Springs, Colorado, on December 24, 1994, at age 72. Moving along, this is Breaking the Brass Ceiling, Women in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a very long war, 1955 to 1975, 20 years. The Vietnam War was fought between North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist countries, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States, Australia, and other anti-communist countries. It began in November 1955 and ended on April 30, 1975, when Saigon fell to North Vietnamese. American leaders believed in the domino theory, which argued that if one country in a region became communist, the surrounding countries would follow, like one domino knocking down another. Not long after the Korean War ended in 1953, the United States became involved in a conflict in Vietnam. Ultimately, the dispute came to represent the battle over communism. The United States feared that if communist North Vietnam won the war, the result would be the spread of communism throughout the area. As with all previous battles, women served in the Vietnam War. By the time America started sending military advisors into the area in 1955, women were involved in every branch of the armed forces, but frankly, their roles were still very limited. Of the 11,000 women who served in Vietnam, 90% served as nurses. The others were air traffic controllers, intelligence officers, clerks, communications experts, weather monitors, and other support jobs. While women were accepted as an important part of the military, they served in a limited number of positions. Every woman who served in Vietnam volunteered for service. That was not true of the men. For most of U.S. history, American males over age 18 had been required to register with the federal government for the draft. If called on, they had to serve in the military. So it was required, all men, once you were 18, if you were physically fit, meaning like you could walk, you could fight, unless you were in a wheelchair or had crutches or were sick and not doing well, you were required to be in the draft and could be called upon to fight at any moment. Whereas women, that was not the case. You had to volunteer. It was a choice. Men did not have a choice, women did. As the Vietnam War continued and the death toll rose, U.S. citizens became increasingly divided over their support for American involvement in the war and over the issue of the draft. Anti-war activists held protests and public demonstrations. Many people turned against the war. In response, in 1973, Congress ended the draft, and the military became an all-volunteer force. This change had a dramatic impact on women in the armed forces. Switching to an all-volunteer force meant that the military needed to create incentives for people to enlist. To lure prospective recruits, the military increased the base pay for soldiers and created more opportunities for women. But now, even with the need for soldiers, there were still limits to what women were allowed to do in the military. As with previous wars, women were not allowed to serve in combat. That's not to say they didn't face significant personal risk. Many female nurses worked in or near combat zones, and they had to deal with other dangers and difficulties of being in remote areas of foreign countries. In fact, 8 women were killed in combat in Vietnam, even though they did not fight or even carry weapons. In some ways, the changes in the military reflected the changes taking place in civilian life during the Vietnam War. The feminist movement and the civil rights movement were reshaping American life. New opportunities opened to women both in and out of the military. More jobs were available to women, and for the first time, there was more chance for advancement, so women could consider a career in the armed forces. So there are many, many great stories for the Vietnam War that we had more access. This was the first televised war. So we were seeing it play out in the news, whereas in the past, at most, we had a radio. And before that, newspapers. Before that, word of mouth. So this was a huge event, well beyond what we're reading. So this is one of my favorite topics. Need to get a little bit older to learn more about that, but there's some amazing women, and I would love to spend time reading through all of their stories, but as always, we're just going to pick one. Some highlights that if you'd like to look into in your personal time. Barbara J. Dulinsky, her story on volunteering in Vietnam. Elaine B. Durick, the Navy's first admiral. Anna Mae Hayes and Elizabeth P. Holston, the generals. Reverend Alice M. Henderson, the first female chaplain. Jean M. Holm, Seeing Stars. Barbara Ann Allen Rainey, Earning Her Wings. And Sharon Ann Lane, Paying the Ultimate Price. Days before the attack, Army nurse First Lieutenant Sharon Ann Lane wrote home, telling her family that things in My Lai, Vietnam had been unusually quiet. When the hospital where she was working came under fire days later, she earned the unfortunate distinction of becoming the first and only military woman killed by enemy fire during the Vietnam War. Sharon Ann Lane was born July 7, 1943, in Zanesville, Ohio. She spent most of her childhood in Canton, graduating from Canton South High School in 1961. She went on to the Altman Hospital School of Nursing, graduating in 1965, and then worked at a local hospital. In 1968, she joined the United States Army Nurse Corps Reserve, training in Texas, and then working at the Army's Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Denver, Colorado. In 1969, she was ordered to Vietnam. On April 29, 1969, Lane was assigned to the intensive care unit of the 312th Evacuation Hospital at Chai Lu. Less than 6 weeks later, on June 8, 1969, the hospital was hit by rocket fire, and Lane was one of the 2 people killed. She was 25 years old. She was awarded the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, among other honors. Do you have what it takes to be a naval aviator? Soldiers must meet a series of qualifications to be considered for training to become a naval pilot. You have to be between 19 and 27 years of age. An undergraduate degree, which is college degree, with a minimum grade point average of a 2.0. 20/40 vision that can be correctable to 20/20. You have to have color vision, so you cannot be colorblind. Normal depth perception. If you're male, you have to be between 62 and 78 inches tall, and if you're female, between 58 inches and 78 inches. You have to be able to swim, and you have to weigh under 235 pounds. Candidates who complete training are obligated to serve a minimum of 8 years in active duty. Student pilots learn basic airmanship, instrument and formation flying, and basic acrobatic maneuvers. Intermediate training is specialized, and soldiers are divided into one of 5 pipelines: jet, turboprop, multi-engine jet, carrier turboprop, and helicopter. All right, we have reached the final section, which is the most relevant to us at this point. Women in the modern military. We are approaching equality. Gone are the days when women needed to pretend to be men to enlist in the military. Gone are the days when women could serve only as nurses and cooks and laundry workers. Gone are the days of women being used in support roles only when the military needed extra hands during wartime. There's no going backward. After the Vietnam War, changes in American culture, particularly the achievements of the women's movement, solidified the role of women in the military. It was clear that women had a lot to offer to the armed forces and that their services were needed. One of the initial and most important signs of meaningful change came in 1976, when the first females were admitted to the service academies: the Military Academy at West Point, New York, the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, and the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. In the first year the doors were opened, more than 350 women entered these programs. The courts also forced the military to provide more opportunities for women. Historically, women had not been allowed to serve on Navy and Marine ships. Yona Owens, a woman who worked as a Navy electrician, filed a class action suit arguing that women should have the right to serve on military ships. In the 1978 case, Owens versus Brown, the United States Supreme Court determined that she was right, and women gained the right to serve on non-combat ships as technicians, nurses, and officers. This legal change extended beyond the Navy. All branches of the armed services opened more positions to females and gave women a chance to compete for leadership roles. This change brought a generation of firsts for women as females took on new responsibilities and rose through the ranks. Women of color also broke barriers, proving that women of all racial backgrounds could be exemplary leaders if given the chance. Over the next 20 years, ideas about women in the military changed as the nature of warfare changed. New weapons such as short-range mobile missiles and roadside bombs redefined the front lines of war, leaving every soldier at risk of injury or death. Women didn't take on combat roles, but combat came to them. Despite the increased risk, women continued to enlist and serve in the military. When the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait in 1990, the United States and 35 other nations responded by sending troops into the area. For the first time, American men and women shipped out together in wartime conditions. When the USS Acadia left for the Persian Gulf on September 5, 1990, almost one-third of the soldiers on board were women. When the war ended in 1991, more than 40,000 women had served in the Gulf War. Women served honorably in that conflict, but the nation had not yet made peace with the idea of women actively fighting in war. The military wanted to be able to use women in aviation units, so it issued a new rule that opened additional opportunities to female soldiers. In 1994, the Department of Defense implemented the combat exclusion policy, stating that women could be assigned to all positions for which they are qualified, except ground combat. Women played critical roles in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. By 2009, the military had established female engagement teams, all female Marine Corps teams that went into various communities and distributed information and gathered intelligence from women in Afghanistan. The combat exclusion policy had an impact on women's careers because high-level promotions often required combat experience. If women could not serve in combat, they could not qualify for the top leadership positions. The final frontier in discrimination was the battlefield. Finally, in 2013, the Defense Department announced that the military would allow women to serve in all military roles within the next 3 years. If members of our military can meet the qualifications for a job, then they should have the right to serve regardless of creed, color, gender, or sexual orientation, said Defense Secretary Leon E. Panetta. The policy was fully implemented in January 2016. All jobs were open to women. They'll be allowed to drive tanks, fire mortars, and lead infantry soldiers into combat, said Defense Secretary Ash Carter. They'll be able to serve as Army Rangers and Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Marine Corps infantry, Air Force parajumpers, and everything else that was previously open only to men. Today, women make up about 15% of the U.S. military. More than 20,000 women are enlisted in the armed services, and more than 35,000 others serve as officers. In 2017, the first 18 women graduated from the Army's first gender-integrated infantry basic training. As long as they meet the requirements for the job, women can serve in any position in any branch of the military. Some highlights. Gwendolyn Bingham, The Heart of a Lion. Colonel Eileen Collins, The Greatest Adventure on This Planet or Off. Sarah Dill, a pilot and a Marine. Tammy Duckworth, a soldier and a senator. Anne Elizabeth Dunwoody, Answering the Call. Sherry Gallagher, Soldier of the Year. Captain Kristen Grease and Lieutenant Shay Haver, Leading the Way. Marcelite J. Harris, Breaking Barriers. Leanne Hester, I was trained to do what I did. Marina A. Hero, first woman to lead an infantry platoon. Katie Higgins, Angels in the Sky. Lori Hill, Into Harm's Way. Patricia D. Horoho, America's Medical Expert. Michelle J. Howard, Redefining the Role of Women in the Navy. Darlene Iskra, The Opportune Moment. Shoshana Johnson, Still Standing. Kathleen McGrath, Aye Man. Linda McTagg, In Command. Marcella Hayes, the first African American pilot. Dr. Antonia Novella, the nation's doctor. Lori Pistua, first Native American woman killed in combat. Coral Wong Piche, the first Asian American general. Lori Robinson, I Happen to Be a Woman. Angela Salinas, Something Greater Than Myself. Sandra Stotts, The Student Becomes the Teacher. Najda West, I Couldn't Wait to Sign Up. Sheila Wendell, Head of the Air Force. And Janet Wolfenbarger, 4 stars in the Air Force. When Janet Carroll Libby Wolfenbarger joined the Air Force in 1980, about 10% of the people serving were women. Today, that number has climbed to about 20%. We're not done, said Wolfenbarger, who became the first 4-star general in the Air Force in 2012. 20% is not representative of demographics of this country, and so we continue to embrace programs that will allow us to attract and retain women for our United States Air Force. Wolfenbarger's career shows that there are opportunities for women to soar through the ranks in the Air Force. She was born in Tampa, Florida in 1958 and graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1980. She spent much of her career involved with acquisition of weapons and aircraft. She returned to school and earned a master's degree in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT in 1985. And another master's in National Resource Strategy from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces in 1994. In 2012, President Barack Obama nominated Wolfenbarger to serve as the first female 4-star general in the Air Force. The Senate confirmed the appointment, and she became the highest-ranking woman in the Air Force on March 26, 2012. In an interview with the Air Force Times, Wolfenbarger said, "She has learned and grown from every opportunity that my Air Force has given me. Still, her success in the Air Force exceeded her expectations. Never would have expected that I would make 1 star, much less 4. Wolfenbarger said in an interview with the New York Times. From 2012 to 2015, Wolfenbarger served as a commander of the Air Force Material Command, meaning she handled equipment and weapons acquisitions for the Air Force. Wolfenbarger retired from the Air Force in July 2015 after more than 35 years of service. Her major military awards include the Air Force Distinguished Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Meritorious Service Medal, Air Force Commendation Medal, Air Force Achievement Medal, and Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, among other honors. She accepted a volunteer position as chair of the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. The committee offers advice and recommendations on issues involving recruitment, retention, and treatment of women in the armed forces. The future success of the military depends on providing equal opportunities for all recruits, regardless of sex. Epilogue. Throughout American history, women have been part of the U.S. military. The women included in this book, as well as hundreds of thousands of others who have not been mentioned by name, have voluntarily served and sacrificed for their country's defense. Their service speaks for itself. More than 200 years of history have demonstrated that women are willing and able to participate in all branches of the armed forces. Women have done what has been asked of them, everything from nursing the sick to flying fighter planes to leading their fellow soldiers in battle. Women make the military stronger, and by making the military stronger, they make America stronger, safer, and more secure. As the various branches of the armed services have opened more positions of responsibility to females, women have been able to demonstrate their skills as they have put their patriotism into action. The armed forces should employ the best qualified soldiers, whether female or male. These service members should be chosen based on ability and performance. They should be smart, dedicated, proud, and willing to love and serve their country. The modern military relies more than ever before on the development and use of advanced technology. Today, a well-trained soldier can use her skills and know how to serve her country by programming drones, directing cyberspace operations, analyzing geospatial data, operating satellite communications equipment, maintaining Patriot launch stations, and performing dozens of other high-tech jobs. In addition, 2018 saw a record number of women veterans running for, being elected to, and serving in Congress. Women like Martha McSally from the Air Force, Elaine Luria from the Navy, Mikey Sherrill from the Navy, Chrissy Houlihan from the Air Force, Amy McGrath from the Marine Corps, and Gina Ortiz-Jones from the Air Force. These women join the other female veterans, such as Tammy Duckworth and Joni Ernst, already serving in Congress. In all these positions, intellect and training matter. Brute strength and gender do not. On the ground, women have also shown that they can be integral members of the combat battalions in the modern military. Even before the Pentagon officially allowed women to fight, some had already served on the battlefield because they had been assigned as intelligence and communications officers with combat units. In her 2013 book, Undaunted, The Real Story of America's Servicewomen in Today's Military, Tanya Bianc wrote about women finally being allowed to serve in combat. It was like finally giving a team jersey to a player who had been hitting home runs in the field for years. Why do women serve in the military? The answer, of course, depends on the individual. For the most part, they serve for the same reasons men do. Because they love their country and feel a patriotic duty to protect it. Because they want to get a good education or technical training and they need assistance paying for school. And because they envision a meaningful and successful career in the armed services. For some, military service is a family tradition. Others want to be the first in their family to put on a uniform and serve. Some women long for adventure. Others long for the security offered by a career in the military. In the future, women will assume more top leadership roles in the military. A time will come when women's right to serve will not be questioned, and society will no longer take special note of a female being promoted to 4-star general or serving as a commander in the Navy or Air Force. And someday, when a woman is finally elected President of the United States, she will serve in the ultimate seat of military authority as a Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Words to live by. These are some of the best-known military mottos of the Armed Forces. The Air Force: aim high, fly, fight, win. Army: this will defend. Army National Guard: you can. Army Rangers: su sponte, or Rangers lead the way. Coast Guard: semper paratus, always ready. 1st Marine Division: no better friend, no worse enemy. Marine Corps: semper fidelis, always faithful. National Guard: always ready, always there. Navy: non sibi sed patrice, not south but country. Navy SEALs: the only easy day was yesterday. And that was Heroism Begins With Her. Thank you for following along in this journey. I myself learned a lot. I hope you learned something too. We will, for our next read aloud, we're going to get started on Christmas Eve.